would suggest that programmatic listening is probably important, particularly in the short term. Right, listening for the customers and the consumers of end products and what's going on in their minds, and starting to learn how to listen for that. And then as you get the signals for we need to be addressing things, then it's time to listen in the other direction where you're going upstream into your supply chain to your suppliers and saying, this is what we're hearing. What are you doing, right, to get out in front of this? What should we be aware of that you're doing for future product development, things you're developing to feed the supply chain that are going to help us address the needs of the market?
Hello, and welcome to Speaking of Supply Chain, where we explore trends, current events, and innovations impacting the logistics and supply chain industries. I'm your host, Ellen Wood. As we enter 2025, the logistics and supply chain sectors are navigating a landscape marked by rapid technological advancements, evolving customer expectations, and significant geopolitical shifts. In this dynamic environment, businesses must adopt forward-thinking strategies to enhance their resilience and adaptability. In today's discussion, we will delve into actionable planning initiatives across 1 year, 3-year, and 5-year horizons, equipping organizations to proactively address emerging challenges and seize opportunities in the evolving supply chain landscape. Today, I am joined by Ron Crabtree and Mike Brown. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you for joining.
Hello.
So I am really looking forward to our discussion today. It promises to be very interesting. But first, let's take a quick moment to get to know both of you a little bit more. Our icebreaker question for today is, what is the last TV show that you binge watched? Ron, why don't you go first?
Well, I thought about that because we watched quite a few of those. So the most recent one is The Diplomat, and something my wife and I really enjoy watching together, and particularly like it because of the witty riposte, right? The British comeback, right? You say something and come back with something really snarky and dry and cutting to the point. And I didn't realize it, but I hosted an international conference last week, and we had some folks from the UK there, and it was really funny that the last 30 days in the UK completely dominated the media was the American elections, which kind of surprised me. But then you think about the relationship between the UK and the United States, no surprise. So I found it just a little interesting insight to, the politics and the dynamics between the UK and the United States.
Mike, what about you? What's the last TV show you binge watched?
Well, I hate to say it, but it was an indulgence, and I'm going to date myself with this one because Mike Tyson in his heyday was during my youth, and we're about the same age, so there's a upcoming match between himself and Jake Paul, and they ran a mini series, 3 episodes, kind of going into the background on Mike Tyson and Jake Paul, and I found it very interesting to see where Mike is today, where he's at in regards to preparation for this match coming up with Jake Paul, and at the end of it, I'm really feeling sorry for Jake Paul as this comes forward. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, that's the last thing I binged, and I was indulging on some of my youth.
My family really enjoys medical dramas, and I have been binge watching the early seasons of Grey's Anatomy again to catch up with what's currently going on, just to refresh my memory. But my oldest son has started binge watching House MD because, again, he likes the British dry humor, the sarcastic wit, and he is just very much, he's 16, so he identifies a lot with it right now. And I don't know, Mike, it might come to blows between him and I if he gets any more sassy. All right, so let's get into our topic for today. I mean, that was fun, but we're not going to binge watch television today. We are going to talk about planning and what is going on with organizations as they are trying to figure out what they're going to do for the next 1, 3, 5 years. A lot has been changing. And so let's get into a 1-year planning horizon. So immediate adjustments, things that they need to be doing right now for 2025. And that might be addressing short-term labor shortages or adapting to new investments, infrastructure that has come about in recent months. How can they address those labor needs, especially if immigration policies change?
There's a lot of pieces to that. If you'd like me to go first, Ellen.
Sure. Why
A
don't
lot of
you
pieces
start
to
us
that.
off?
Well, go ahead,
A lot of
Ryan.
pieces.
All right, so I'll get us started, and then bring Mike in here. And as it happens, we're actually in the middle of doing a study around for manufacturing in general about how to cope with what we're calling the forever labor shortage, and the fact that across the board, and supply chain being integral to that, it's North America, the growth of the workforce is going down every year. It's not going up, so it's going to become even more acute in almost every Western country. And we kind of got started with this study. We've got 65 different things you might look at in these sorts of categories, right? Being the employer of choice, workforce development strategies, both the development and workforce planning, public-private partnerships, business process outsourcing, near and offshoring, digitization of work, digital transformation, use of interim part-time talent to fill the gap, and then traditional management consulting to plug and play in certain places, and then finally, accelerated continuous improvement. Think about good old-fashioned Lean Six Sigma. Identify the waste and go get rid of it as quickly as you can, which would be, kind of a short-term thing you could do. So those are kind of like the categories. When we think about short-term, within the next year, a few things popped into my head. And one of the things I thought is really important to look at that can turn quickly is digitization of work. There's a lot of talk about AI in the workplace. And if we focus in on supply chain organizations, and logistics, for example, I have my own podcast called MetaPod. You go to metaexperts.com, there's a button for MetaPod. And I have thought leaders come in and talk about the three common challenges that tangible goods organizations face. So I actually had Derek Browning with Uber Freight as one of my guests, and he specifically wanted to talk about the application of AI and digitization in the logistics industry. And one of the things he said that really kind of got my attention is you've got to look at what's consuming people's time and take away the non-meaningful work very quickly. And there are technologies, and they're emerging quarterly, that can be used to plug and play and tackle critical elements of what the workforce is tied up doing that can free up the resources. Something I heard recently that was pretty cool is, is AI going to take over all of the work for supply chain folks? And, the answer is really no. But then the statement was made, okay, so it's AI with people is going to outperform people without AI. I thought that was pretty insightful. So I'll take a breath here and let Mike jump in.
I want to jump in really quick. I actually went to a marketing conference a couple weeks ago, and the same thing came up when it comes to AI and taking over the jobs or the tasks that need done. And as much as we hear that AI is going to take jobs, it's not going to take jobs. It's going to help the people do it more efficiently and effectively. And the people with AI experience are going to take the jobs. It's not going to be AI on its own. It's going to be the people who know how to harness it and get the best out of it. So I wholeheartedly agree. How about you, Mike? What do you think?
I think the AI is going to have an interesting play, right? And I think it's, there's going to be a paradigm shift in regards to the workforce related to the adoption of AI, right? I think AI has got strong applications. I don't think it's going to be a huge displacement of workforce other than a paradigm shift of that workforce and their skill set, right? Jobs will become quicker, more nimble. You can do more revisions, more automation being used towards that. The one thing that I other than AI though, when we talk about general automation of work tasks, one of the things I have as a call out is, as we look at the labor force today, and we're continually displacing labor force with general automation. And for example, think about going into a Home Depot or Lowe's today, and you've got all these self-checkouts, right? Well, we displaced a certain band of labor requirement in the workforce. And I would never say that those jobs that were being done were career type jobs, but they were stepping stones, or they were a second monetary income to create some better liquidity for the family income, right? So part-time fulfillment, things like that. as a working class, we're eliminating those jobs. And now what do people do for that gap, right? Where they needed a little extra, or you got a college student that's trying to pay his way through. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see where we've raised the wages to now allow us to offset the cost of automation. And now automation is being placed into those manual jobs. And I think it's going to be an interesting what we leave behind now that we've eliminated those jobs in the workforce.
It's a great point. So aside from labor, there are some other aspects for a 1-year planning horizon that organizations should keep in mind, especially given some recent changes in the U.S. landscape, the political landscape, and that's going to be some environmental regulations. We've talked about that a few times on this podcast with some different guests. But given the changes from the recent election, what are some practical, maybe short-term steps that companies can take to stay compliant with some of these new sustainability requirements that are going to very likely start imposing regulations on the way companies go about doing business?
I'll let
Mike,
you
do
take
you
that
want to
one
start
first,
us off?
Mike.
Oh,
Yeah, Ron, you want me to start?
Please do.
Yeah, I see a couple things there with sustainability, right? I think U.S., North America is behind Europe in regards to sustainability efforts. And I think it's a culture change, right, that we're looking at. But I think people are concerned about it. They want to do better. But yet companies, there's a cost of business, right? I think short term, what they're looking at is, hey, are there initiatives that I should be looking at that could potentially also have a reduction in my cost? So looking at things like electric vehicles, getting rid of your inside the four walls of your warehouse, switching from, propane trucks to electric trucks and things like that. And now you've got newer battery technology coming out, which makes those even better, right? Looking at supply chain management and sustainability practices there, and starting to push a little bit on your vendors in regards to, hey, I need you to be a little bit more greener in regards to what you're doing upstream, because I'm going to rate myself in regards to my supply chain also. So I think some of those initial, what I would call immediate term things that they're going to look at is where can they drive and pick up some low-hanging fruit related to cost, where the initiatives make sense. I think the longer term ones are going to be down the road in regards to what makes ethical sense in regards to what I need to be as a company moving forward. And I think we're going to see evolution for companies in regards to their strategies and things like that. But I think that's more midterm, long term.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's Ron Crabtree here, and I would suggest that programmatic listening is probably important, particularly in the short term. Right, listening for the customers and the consumers of end products, and what's going on in their minds, and starting to learn how to listen for that. And then as you get the signals for we need to be addressing things, then it's time to listen in the other direction, where you're going upstream into your supply chain to your suppliers and saying, this is what we're hearing. What are you doing? Right? To get out in front of this. What should we be aware of that you're doing for future product development, things you're developing to feed the supply chain that are going to help us address the needs of the market? And it's incredible. I've heard some amazing stories, just like, some person talks about their experience with, I think with Burger King or something I heard recently, and it wasn't even a paid thing. They just kind of showed up and made this assertion, of the experience they had, and it just blew the doors out, with a certain kind of product really becoming professional, preferred. Those things are terribly, can be very disruptive. So learning how to listen for, the short-term things you need to be prepared to address, right? And respond to, and using that to signal to what Mike said. You got to really have that longer term strategy. We got to feed that with something, and there are things you can do short term, to be prepared. And educating your workforce, the people that come into contact with customers, you need to be continually informed about what's going on out there, so that they can properly respond as your avatar, as your representative to market, would be things that would pop into my head.
Yeah, it's interesting how public perception and the availability of media and, being able to put out your own content. So when it comes to those environmental regulations, the question for companies is it going to be top down where the government imposes this regulation that I have to follow, that I have to be in compliance with? Or is this going to really come from, a grassroots movement or some influencer, some individual who had an experience with my brand, decided to talk about it and put a video out there on social media, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram. And then all of a sudden, this is what's driving the reason for changes, because there's a public perception of either positive or negative in that regard, where companies are going to have to react to it. They can't just ignore that voice of the customer. So that's a very interesting point and an important point, especially when it comes to identifying risks to your organization from both sides. So let's move into a 3-year planning horizon. So we're looking for somewhere between 2026 and 2028. And I think this is where really digital transformation initiatives are going to have the most impact, because those aren't going to, even if someone's starting them now, they're not going to be in place. They're not going to have an impact immediately. They may have some low-hanging fruit, some quick wins, but how should companies approach that technology investment, that midterm technology investment, in order to improve their adaptability, managing some of these shifts that we talked about in labor due to automation? Like, is that going to be a significant shift in this industry? Ron, what do you think?
It is, and I was going to share an example. So I happen to be pretty, aware of all the things going on from a digitization perspective that companies can think about. Back in 2020, we were contracted with a large international e-learning company to build an all-new digital transformation awareness program. So I pulled together a team of our Meta experts. These are the interim professionals we built relationships with that we use for projects for our customers. They were experts in digital transformation. We mapped out almost 30 different elements of digital transformation, AI being just one, right? Edge sensor technologies, Internet of Things, blockchain, just the list goes on and on. And then we mapped those to different industries and also different functions and organizations. And one of the things that really jumped out at me is, you've got to aim, right? So digitization is death by 1,000 cuts. There's no silver bullet cure. AI is not going to sweep in here and solve all of our problems. So I advocate that when you're looking at those mid-range things, you have to think about what is it about how we perform that we need to improve, right? So as an example, I had a chance to work with a company that produces buildings, right? There's metal storage buildings that you store stuff in, right? So everybody's familiar with that. And their issue is that strategically, it was taking way too long in that whole bidding, ordering and getting the specification they need to actually get supply chain kicked off. They had to collapse that cycle. It was taking way too much time. And it was a very strategic differentiator for them to figure out how to collapse both the time and the effort, because they couldn't hire enough engineers and enough people to work in sales, right, to grow the company. So what do? How do we make that better? So enter, value stream mapping. And we basically mapped out the process of every touch from the first contact with a customer to production-ready release of drawings and information for ERP and sourcing and all those things to kick off. And by mapping in all of the electronic touches, we determined that, the sales side had like 23 different IT systems and data sources they have to work with. And then on the engineering side, they had 23 other ones they needed to interface with and work with. And we identified at the step level the primary and secondary touches, along with the human effort, the delay time, and the first-time quality capability. And with that, you could do an old-fashioned Pareto analysis, the 80-20 rule, of what 20% of the steps consume most of the physical clock time, what 20% of the steps were the cost, and then, of course, the quality capability. And that led us up the breadcrumb trail, going, we've got folks up on the sales end, hurrying up and pushing things through toward engineering very quickly, thinking it's helping, when in fact we had to go with the upfront process and integrate in the CRM and the various touches at the beginning of the process. Some of the elements they were doing much later in the engineering and actually pulling those forward and creating automation. This is not a quick fix. Just a CRM implementation can take a year, let alone an integration with product data management functionality. but allowed them to really begin to envision what was possible. And that led to restructuring the work, right? So, in other words, they needed fewer people in engineering and more people in sales with a different skill set. And then, totality of that, much less labor required, but a much faster and much higher quality from a data generation perspective to be able to generate right the first time drawings, instructions, and specifications to launch the supply chain. So that would, in my mind, be kind of that mid-range of, leveraging the good old-fashioned lean thinking, but modernizing it to what it is we're looking for, why we're looking for that, and how we use that to identify where to focus scarce time, money, and resources to get the biggest bang for the buck for critical business processes. So I'll take a breath here and let Mike jump in.
Yeah, Ryan, I got to concur with you on that. I mean, the S&OP, or the sales and operation planning component that companies are going through today, we're seeing it today is companies are starting to really focus on that. And like, how do we lean out this processes? How do we get into looking at, because we have the capabilities now to really use data, right? And that's really where I think the evolution is we've got all this data coming from all these systems. What does it mean, right? So the data analytics that companies are getting into today to understand it, say, hey, look, here's this time window, which you explained in your example, and we've got all this going on. How do we lean this process out, right? And how do we create a better conduit from our sales through our operation planning and get rid of the noise? And I think that's huge in regards to what companies are looking at today. We're seeing it, that companies are really looking at that. And I think that's where the digitalization is really creating this evolution of how lean companies can get and understanding who they are today, right? And then being able to make a better mousetrap in the future.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And another element, which I'm sure Mike's familiar with, is, you think about the supply chain operations reference model developed by the Supply Chain Council years ago, and then Apex ASCM acquired it, and I think they're sunsetting it now. It's kind of freeware out there on the internet. But they're finding, upside and downside adaptability, right? What percentage of impact can you change, a shorter term change within the next 6 to 12 months, a big impact to demand, both upward and downward, can we cope with without undue cost, right, and disruption to the supply chain? And that creates a breadcrumb trail, right? And another thing I'd like to encourage organizations to think about, we're thinking that midterm, that 1, 2, 3 years, or maybe further, say, what kind of organization would put us out of business? If I was going to design a competitor that could eat our lunch, what will they be doing? What would they be doing differently? What's their supply chain network like? What are the capabilities they would bring? What are the technologies they'd be using, whether they exist or not? And beginning to map those out, what could happen, and using that to fuel what you're focusing in on as an organization. So, Mike, I don't know if you're seeing that.
I think we're seeing a lot of companies are looking at, they're really trying to evolve, and they're trying to, one thing that we see is it's their supply chain, and like, are they almost looking at it from the standpoint of, let's greenfield what we've done for the last 50 years, and how would we be doing it today? And then you take that and say, how do we move forward? Because I need to brownfield it. I can't greenfield it, right? So what did we learn? What is the lesson learned here from looking at what we should be? This is what we are today, and can we bridge that? And what will it take us to bridge that?
I like that a lot. That's really good.
Interesting. So in other 3-year midterm horizons, what besides, I mean, we've talked about technology and a little bit about labor. What else is really going to impact that, couple years for our organizations?
I'm going to jump in for just a second here. We can't avoid thinking about what's changing in the world. You mentioned that earlier, Ellen. Regulatory changes, things coming down the pike. With the Republican control, apparently for all 3 branches in the United States coming up, there's going to be big shifts in tariffs and things like that. And one of the things that has been big in the last under the Biden administration was Defense Production Act, and then also the Department of Energy funding that was pushed out there, to impact industries. But what most people don't know is a lot of money's out there in just general supply chain and collaboration around supply chain best practices. Well, there's funding and money out there, but what's important about that I learned the hard way. I actually had some panelists at one of my podcasts that if you want to be positioned to actually take advantage of and tap into federal funding and be able to get on, get inside track to who's doing what out there to leverage going forward, that's not, oh, let's do that next week or next month. That could be a year or two in the making. You've got to get started today. Like this is, as we're recording this podcast, if a year from now you'd want to see some benefit and some real traction from tapping into those sorts of programs. So if you haven't started that, that's something you better be putting on your radar. Mike, have you been seeing that at all?
I'm aware of from the federal funding standpoint and that there's things available for companies, but even the companies that are going through evolutions and they're self-funding, like you're looking at that medium 2 to 3 year term to do any major right sizing in regards to your operational flows, your supply chain initiatives, automation. Like you don't pull the trigger on an automated DC and have it operational in 30 days. You're talking 18, 24 months before realization. And then stabilization of that operation, you're probably looking at 6 months past your go live date. So, that becomes some midterm stuff in regards to companies being able to reevaluate where they're at, if they're looking at levels of automation, how that automation gets applied into their business strategy and what that roadmap looks like over the next 2 to 3 years while they wait for realization.
All right, moving on to slightly longer timeline. So if we're going to look at a 5-year planning horizon, then we're looking at the supply chain as a whole. We're not looking for quick wins anymore. We're looking for substantial overarching changes. And so one of the ways to do that, not only with technology, but also collaborative relationships with other businesses, whether upstream, downstream, or horizontally. What types of partnerships or ecosystem investments should companies think about in order to build those resilient and future-proof supply chains?
Yeah, Rod Crabtree, I'd like to pop in on that one for a couple of minutes. And so one of the podcast guests was Alan Willett, with a company called Exceptional Difference. He talked about this wisdom gap and the phenomena that as the baby boomers are retiring out, we haven't developed the future workforce. And he advocates that this is the longer term thing. This is the years in the making, right? It's a company culture thing of putting it out there. Look, we need to have an actual functionally robust mentorship program. So as we're bringing new people into the supply chain workforce, we're actually putting them into the responsibility of making some of those critical decisions under control, under mentorship, but allowing them to get the bloody nose and do some other things in a controlled fashion and learn by the mistakes, because there's certain things you can't learn vicariously. You've got to experience them. So I found that pretty interesting. And then the other one that I think doesn't get nearly enough press is I'll call it public-private partnerships. And I've seen some cool stuff, isolation. I heard a story about an inner city organization focused on bringing in German trades skills and training up inner city children to be able to enter skilled trades, both to maintain buildings and the like within that municipality in the city, but also to be, people that can go into the maintenance and operations departments to keep manufacturing plants running. I think that's brilliant. So I think organizations that are thinking longer term is, do I have a chief, I'll call it people officer? Is that aligned at the board level? And have really thought about our basis for competition 5, 10, or even 15 years into the future, and where are the people going to come from to fill those jobs? Because the fact is, you're still going to need somebody to turn a wrench on those machines. I'm sorry. You're still going to need to pipe things through. You're still going to need wire. Machines are going to break. They're going to have to be, just basic infrastructure would be a great thing to think about. There are not enough people entering the workforce in those trades. They're not. Okay, so the problem's going to get worse. So what are we doing to create the environment so our organization, our community, this is why I talk about the public-private partnership, is are we tapping into available funding to help us fund, kindergarten, grade school, beginning to introduce children to the notion that manufacturing and supply chain and engineering are professions they should aspire to other than being astronauts or lawyers or doctors. The fact is we need those people. So you've got to, it gets stigmatized. Well, if you're not going to be a doctor, then must be you're a failure. Well, that's wrong. That's just plain wrong. And we've got to stop that kind of social dialogue and retool the dialogue around what are the meaningful jobs that keep this world humming in the future, where you can, in fact, be a contributor to society without being, some fancy degree professional. So I'm on a rant, so I'll take a breath here.
Ron, I love the rant because, I think we've come out of this school where, hey, you need to go to college, get a 4-year degree, then go get your cushy job and make big bucks, and that's your career path. And I'm so in favor of the traditional trades and things like that. Like, people don't necessarily understand, like, those guys, if you get your certifications and things like that, you're in demand and you're making a very nice living. And I think that's one of the things that needs to be understood more, and pushed more, and from the school levels up, from coming out of high school, the vocational learnings, redeveloping some of that, I think is huge. On the other piece of that, we were kind of talking about the digitalization, right? And the one thing that I really liked it where you're hitting home on, Ron, was that mentorship, right? As we get into this digitalization, it creates a lot of quantitative analysis, right? And what people are not going to have is numbers. They say don't lie, but numbers lie, right? They don't necessarily paint the true picture. And without having a qualitative mindset to understand when data is telling me something, and do I react to it one way or the other, that is the gap that's there, because the baby boomers are leaving the workforce. That 30 years of experience of understanding, hey, this is how this runs well, and the data starts to flip out differently and saying, no, we need to knee-jerk react to what's happening. It's like, no, you need to kind of slow down and understand what this is, because it cycles, right? So I think some of that that's going to get lost is the qualitative reasoning that people have to have when they're looking at quantitative data, because that's going to be lost in the workforce as all the baby boomers exit.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I'd just like to add on to it, expand on that for a second, Mike, is urge organizations really think about, what's that workforce of the future look like in supply chain and elsewhere. Supply chain is kind of our topic here. But what's the nature of work look like 10 years from now? Okay. And then you got to come down a level and say, so who are the individuals who are really impacted by that, right? Because it's going to be different, right? The nature of the work they're doing is going to be different. So what's our strategy to develop that workforce of the future? The mentorship program to prepare the leaders of the future to work in that environment. And then what is the soft landing that we're prepared to invest in for the people that would be displaced? I loved your example of the folks running the cash registers, at the Home Depot or the Costco or whatever. I think those organizations probably have a plan for those folks. They're not disclosing it, probably because it's part of their secret sauce, part of their company culture. But you got to bet they've given that some thought. So we're all kind of challenged as leaders in our organizations for, what is it that's going to be different for those folks? And I'm going to tell you right now, I work with organizations that are attempting to digitize, and they keep finding out over and over again the number one barrier is people, because they're scared. They don't understand. They're going to actively or passively disrupt and fight you all the way. That's because we haven't done a good job at all as leaders of defining what the future of work looks like, and then equipping them to do that work, or failing that, how are we going to retool those people so that they can, A, go into a different industry altogether? Maybe they're not even working for us anymore, but we're enabling them to be able to go into a different industry as part of our greater good strategy as an organization. Let's face it, if we need 5 people to produce a unit today and we're going to need 2 3 years from now, then we have an obligation to think about how we're going to prepare people for that.
Yeah. And to kind of dovetail on that, Ron, a client that we've been working with on a current project is, we were having these discussions in regards to automation, right? And it's this displacement of certain jobs. And they were adamant that, Mike, we do not want you to say job reduction. we will repurpose these people because these are valuable people in the organization. We will take them and give them another opportunity, but we're not getting rid of people because we're having a tough time finding people. And, they have a backlog of what they're trying to do. And like, we'll take somebody that is currently driving a forklift that has been with us for 10, 15 years, and we will put training into them to allow them to do like a next level job up. But we want the people that are fitting the culture, that have the mindset that want to be here and that have worked hard for the company, and we're going to make sure that we find a place for them. So that was a strong message that, at least from that company, that, hey, we value the people, and I don't want to lose them. We're going to repurpose them.
I agree with that. What I'm hoping for, had this dinner discussion last night with some really cool people in Detroit, and we were lamenting that publicly traded organizations are driven to the quarterly results, right? Private equity investment organizations driven to the next flip of ownership. They really are not willing to invest in that 3, 5, even 10-year approach. So how do we make that bulletproof? Right? How do we embed that into the psyche of the future organization? At dinner last night, they asked me, who's the company you really admire? And I had to sit there and really think hard about that because I'm telling you, I have kind of a jaundiced view of, corporate behavior. And, we're really serious about 3, 5, 7, 10 years. Are we really serious? And then what are we doing to make that bulletproof? That's a challenge I've put out there that corporate America, in my mind, is just not able to, in the current state, think that way as much as we would like. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, that's the big yin yang right now, right? Is how do you maintain stockholder equity for short-term gains versus how do I project my company long-term to be successful? And those two compete against each other all day long.
All right. So reflecting on the growing role of sustainability, we've talked about it in a couple areas here today. And over the next 5 years, some of those policies that are coming into play are going to be at that point enforced. How can companies set sustainability as just a core organizational operational principle, building it into every aspect of their supply chain? Because we have some deadlines coming up. Globally and even regionally, some deadlines on those sustainability goals with the Paris Accords and other legislation. How can they, be ready for those and set themselves up for success? We've only got a few years to do it.
Hey, Ron, I'll start on this one.
Thank you.
I think what we're going to see here is companies have to have a cultural change from the top. They need to look at their overall strategies, how these strategies are applying down and filtering through the organization, but it needs to be a top-down approach that the company says, hey, we want to be this type of company now. You all need to get on board and we need to start looking at things a certain way. And until that happens, they're crossing the T's and dotting the I's to meet the mandates that are coming through.
I completely agree with that. And I would add to that the second piece of the puzzle is, as the top leaders, is, finding out what we need to focus on, right? And so every industry, the basis of competition is going to be a little different. You're early in the growth curve. Are you mature? Are you in decline? Is it an industry that's going to be fundamentally changed through technologies and things that are coming from legislation perspective? And it really comes down almost on a company by company basis of drawing that down. Here's the laundry list. I mentioned, the 65 things you can do to deal with a forever labor shortage. You can't do all 65. You're not going to. So you've got to get really, really precise around what are the key things we want to embed in our culture, the basis for competition in the future, the reality we're going to be in, and draw it down to, okay, what do we need to be listening for, right? Mike said it really well. What are the leading indicators we need to be paying attention to tell us when to pull the trigger on certain things? Yeah, so I was just piggybacking on what Mike had to say and just drawing attention to, it really comes down to almost like a personal thing. Like a corporation is really like a person. Right? It's got life, goes through cycles, it starts everything as an amateur and it's got to learn how and blah, 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 just like people. So it's the same thing. It's a very personal thing at the corporate level around what are we focusing on and why, and then embedding that in the psyche, so that it's bulletproof and doesn't change with the next CEO or the next owners even, and has its life of its own that can be sticky in the fabric of how the company operates. It's just basically an operating system that's integrated so deeply into how they do business and what they are that you can't undo it very easily.
Hey, Ron, and I think to add to that too is where companies look at change management and how do they go about making these changes and making them stick. And that is one of the toughest things I think that organizations have is managing that change management component of how do I get from point A to point B and not upset the apple cart and make everybody run with their hair on fire and run scared, right? So I think that is a huge initiative there.
Yeah, that's the subject of an entire podcast in and of
Yeah,
itself.
for sure. But I got people that talk about that.
All right, gentlemen. So some final thoughts on achieving the right balance between that short-term flexibility and a sustainable long-term vision. What are some of the key indicators that supply chain leaders should be monitoring to make these informed decisions and to adjust their strategies over time?
So it's Ron, and I would just, kind of repeat something I said earlier is, get good at listening for the short and long-term indicators, listening to the market, listening to the governments that you do business in. Where do you sell? And what's going on in those geographies, politically, economically, et cetera. Learning how to listen for both the short and long-term indicators is of significant change. And then becoming skillful at moving that upstream into your organization. What are we hearing? What does that mean to us? What can we rationalize from that? And then better at going upstream to the listening and engagement of supply partners upstream for, okay, what are you hearing? Because guess what? I might be selling, 10% of my products into this market. We probably have suppliers that live there every day, right? In that market, they know a whole lot about it that we're never going to learn. So how do we engage and create the collaboration across the value chain so we can have this active dialogue of both the medium, short, and long-term strategy? Now, that's just kind of both short and medium term. And then the bigger picture perspective, what is the basis to compete 5, 10, 15 years into the future? What does that workforce look like in that future? What markets are we in, and what do the technologies look like that we're dealing with? And have those scenarios out in front of you and basically having your roadmap thought through is as we get these indicators, what path does that suggest, and do we have the right things in place so that we can move in that direction? So if we're going to button it up, that's people, process, and technology, but using the market and market forces and political forces we can anticipate, shape what we commit to.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Ron, 100%. And I think it's also the companies are looking at it, and if they're in the forefront of this and they look at the different things they can do for sustainability, can they be an early adapter, right, to those technologies or strategies that would be applied? And does it create a cost benefit for the company, right? Because if they can monetize it, they will implement it, right? And they will gain traction faster. There's the ones that you have to do that are going to cost you, right? But I think there are things out there that companies can do in regards to, hey, what do we do in regards to, renewable energy sources? Again, can we invest in that pays us back in that 5 to 10 year window?
That's a great example.
I think some of those type of initiatives in designing lean and designing clean products, right? Like how do we create and use more recycled content, even though that's a benefit to us and it's a benefit to the customers and it's a benefit to the environment, right? So I think as they get better at looking at some of these sustainable efforts, they can become the early adopters in that technologies or the strategies that they're applying. I think it does create that cost benefit for them long term, but they got to probably pay the piper up front to get there.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for your insights. I know that our listeners are going to really enjoy this episode. So I look forward to getting some feedback from our listeners out there of what they thought about these 1, 3, and 5-year planning horizon tips, tactics, insights. For our listeners, if you have a suggestion for a topic or would like to be a guest on our show, please reach out to me. We'd love to hear from you. You can contact me at podcast@miebach.com at any time. As always, thank you for listening to Speaking of Supply Chain. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whichever podcast platform you prefer. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. Be sure to tune in next time.